Montana Territory, April 1877. The wind was sharp that morning, sweeping down from the Rockies like it was chasing ghosts, and Xander Ames nearly missed the sight of her in the hayloft. He had been heading out to check the eastern fence line when he saw the barn door cracked open, just enough to catch his eye. It was strange, he always closed it at night. Rifle slung over his shoulder, he stepped inside cautious and quiet, boots crunching straw. That was when he saw her. Curled up in the far corner of the loft, half covered in a worn wool blanket, her belly round as a harvest moon. Her hands were cradled around it, like she was trying to shield the child inside. She was asleep, but not resting peacefully, her brow furrowed, face pale, like she had not known safety in a long time. He stared for a second too long. Then he cleared his throat, loud enough to be heard but not harsh. Her eyes flew open. Wide, dark, wild. She sat up fast, then winced, one hand pressing to her side. "I ain't here to cause trouble," she said quickly, voice raspy. "I just needed somewhere warm." Xander lowered his rifle. "You are not the first to wander in for shelter," he said calmly. "But you are the first to be carrying a child." She looked like she wanted to run, but she was too tired. Her clothes were worn thin, boots caked in dried mud, and her cheeks hollow like she had missed more meals than she had eaten. He took a slow step closer. "My name's Xander Ames. This is my land. You are welcome to rest here, but I would rather know your name." She hesitated, then said, "Clara Whitlow." "How far along are you, Clara?" "8 months, maybe more." "You alone?" Her eyes flicked away. "Yes." He did not ask why. He could read enough in her silence. "You hungry?" She nodded once. "Come on then," he said, gesturing toward the house. "There is stew on the stove." She hesitated before standing, one hand on her back, the other steadying herself on the post. Xander watched her closely, not to judge, but to make sure she would not fall. She followed him in silence across the yard, the wind tugging at her patched coat. Inside the house, the wood stove was warm, and the scent of rabbit stew filled the air. He ladled a bowl and set it down in front of her at the table. She sat slowly, like every inch ached. "You live out here alone?" Clara asked after a few minutes of careful eating. Xander nodded. 5 years now." "No family?" He shook his head. "Not anymore." She did not ask more. She only ate slow and quiet, like she had forgotten what it felt like to be full. When she finished, she let out a soft breath and sat back, looking around the small cabin. It was simple wood walls, stone fireplace, a few shelves of books, a rocking chair by the window. "It is peaceful here," she said. "That is why I stayed." He offered her the bed for the night. She tried to protest, but he cut her off. "You are carrying a child," he said. "You need rest. Take the bed." That night, Xander slept in the rocking chair. The wind howled outside, but inside the cabin it was quiet. Safe, he found her again the next morning in the barn. Not hiding this time, just sitting on a bale of hay, one hand resting on her stomach, watching the horses. "You sleep all right?" he asked. She nodded. "Better than I have in weeks." He walked in slow, giving her space. "You planning on going somewhere?" She looked down. "I do not know any more. I was heading west. Thought maybe there'd be work or help in Helena." "You will not make it far in your condition." "I know," she whispered. He stood there a moment, watching her. Then he said quietly, "You can stay as long as you need." Her eyes filled, but she blinked fast and looked away. Over the next week, Clara stayed. She helped when she could, washing dishes, feeding the chickens, sweeping the porch. Xander never asked her for anything, but he noticed the way she folded his shirts neatly after they dried, or how she set an extra spoon beside her bowl at supper like she had always lived there. He caught her humming once while she stirred the stew. Soft, like a lullaby. She stopped when she noticed him listening. "Sorry," she said. "Do not be," he replied. It was nice. They sat together most evenings, not saying much, just sharing the space. He would carve wood by the fire, she would rub her belly, eyes half closed, tired but peaceful. One night near sunset, he found her asleep again in the barn. She had gone out to see the horses and must have dozed off in the hay. He stood in the doorway watching her breathe. He stepped inside, slow and quiet. She stirred, then opened her eyes. "Sorry," she murmured, sitting up. "I must have fallen asleep." "You look peaceful," he said. Clara smiled faintly. "I feel safe here." Xander looked at her, really looked. Her hair was loose, her face soft in the golden light, and there was something in his chest that tightened and eased at the same time. He walked toward her and crouched beside the hay bale. Then he said, voice low and certain, "You are the only thing missing from my home." She went still. "I mean that," he said. "This place, it has been quiet for a long time. I thought I liked it that way, but since you came, it has felt full. Alive." Her eyes filled again, and this time she let the tears fall. "I did not think anyone would want me," she whispered. "Not like this, not now." "I do," he said. "I do, Clara." She reached out and he took her hand. Her fingers were small and cold, but they curled tight around his. They sat there in the soft light of the barn, hands joined, hearts open in a way neither had dared in years. And for the first time in a long time, both of them believed in something good. The snow melted slow that spring, soaking the earth deep and dark. Clara stood at the edge of the field behind the house, one hand resting on the small of her back as she watched the first green tips push through the thaw. Her breath came short, and she paused every few steps, but she moved with a quiet steadiness, as if she had decided not to let the weight of the coming birth bend her more than it had to. Xander was working the fence line again, hammering in new posts where the winter winds had knocked them loose. He glanced up once and saw her there, a shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, hair pinned in a way that must have taken time, though she hadn't said where she'd found the energy. She hadn't asked to stay permanently, but she hadn't spoken of leaving again either. That afternoon he found her inside, standing over a basin of water, scrubbing a linen shift with short, determined strokes. "You ought to be resting," he said, setting the bucket of nails down by the door. Clara didn't look up. "If I stop moving, I start thinking." He crossed the room and leaned against the rough pine wall. "Thinking about what?" She wrung the cloth out slow, her hands pale against the fabric. "What kind of life this baby's born into? What I have to offer it." She paused, then added, "What I've already done wrong." Xander didn't speak for a long moment. Then he said, "My father used to say a child needs two things: shelter and someone who won't leave when things get hard. I don't think he ever learned how to give either." She looked over then, something wary in her eyes, like she wasn't sure if she was being offered comfort or tested. "You're nothing like him," she said finally. "No," he replied. "I aim not to be." She returned her attention to the shift, folding it carefully and setting it in the basket beside her. "You ever think about having a family?" "I did once," he said, voice low. "A long time back." "What happened?" "She died. Spring floods came through the valley, took the cart." "Took her with it." Clara's hands stilled. "I built that fence the next week," he continued. "Didn't stop building for years. House, barn, smokehouse. Thought if I kept adding, it'd feel less empty." She stepped closer, the weight of her child slowing her stride, and placed her hand on the table near his. "You got quiet strength, Xander. But even that needs someone to lean on sometimes." He looked at her hand, fingers thin and raw from cold water, and then at her face, so open and steady despite all she carried. "I don't want to just offer shelter," he said. "I want to build something that lasts." Clara's mouth curved, not in a smile but in something softer, something like hope. That night the wind settled and the sky cleared. She didn't return to the barn. Instead, she sat in the rocker by the fire, her feet wrapped in a wool blanket while Xander sorted through a drawer of old tools, checking the hinges on a cradle he'd once carved and never used. He paused when he saw her watching. "It's not finished," he said. Her gaze lingered on the smooth curve of the wood, the faint carving of pine branches along the side. "It will be," she said. "And it'll be more than enough." Later, when the fire had burned low and the last of the coals glowed red, she whispered, "I've never had someone speak to me like I was worth staying for." "You are," he answered, his voice the only sound in the stillness. "And I will." She didn't cry. She only looked at him like she was memorizing the lines of his face, the measure of his promise. They said nothing else that night, but when he rose to stoke the fire, he laid a second quilt over her legs, careful not to wake her. Then he sat nearby, not to guard, but simply to be close. Outside, the land held its breath between seasons. Inside, something was beginning. The baby came 3 days after the last frost broke. It was just before dawn when Clara's cry pulled Xander from a restless sleep. He was on his feet before his mind had caught up, moving toward the sound without thought. She was gripping the edge of the kitchen table, her face tight with pain but her voice steady. "It's starting," she said, breath short. "Water broke an hour ago." He nodded once, already reaching for the clean linens and kettle. She had told him what she'd learned from her grandmother, how the women in her family had always birthed at home, how to breathe through the pain, how to recognize when something was wrong. Still, her hands trembled when he brought her the basin, and her forehead was damp. Xander cleared the table, spread the linens, and stoked the fire higher. He didn't ask if she was sure. He could see it in how she moved, slower now but certain. They worked without speaking for a long while, he fetching what she needed, she folding into herself with each wave. As the sun lifted over the ridge, streaking the sky with rose-colored light, she sank to her knees beside the bed and pressed her forehead into her arm. "Xander," she whispered. "Don't leave me." "I won't." He knelt beside her, one hand on her shoulder, the other steadying her back. She leaned into him when the pain came again, and he held her as she bore down, her breath ragged, every fiber of her straining. The hours stretched thin, each one heavier than the last. Outside, the world softened with spring, but inside, time moved only by her breath and the sound of water shifting in the kettle. By late afternoon, her strength began to fray. She gripped his arm harder, face pale and streaked with sweat. "I can't." "You can," he said, voice low near her ear. "You already are." Her fingers dug into his sleeve, and then one final cry tore from her throat. After it came silence, thick and waiting. Then the child's cry rose into the room, sharp, new, alive. Xander didn't move, didn't speak. He just watched as Clara reached, hands shaking, and pulled the child to her chest. Her head dropped forward, hair falling loose across her face, and her shoulders shook. He placed a blanket around both of them. She looked up at him then with an expression he hadn't seen before, something between exhaustion and awe. "It's a girl," she whispered. He knelt beside her again, brushing the damp hair from her temple. "She's strong," he said. "So strong." Clara's voice cracked. She came through it all. They stayed there on the floor, the three of them, while the fire hissed low and the last of the daylight slipped through the windows. When Clara finally looked at him again, her eyes were clearer. "I didn't think I'd live through it," she said. "You did. I thought I'd be alone. You're not." She ran her fingers along the baby's cheek. "She needs a name." Xander hesitated, then asked, "What did your mother call you when you were small?" Clara smiled faintly. "Wren. She said I used to sing before I could talk." He looked at the child, her tiny hand fisted against Clara's chest. "Then maybe she should be Lark." Clara leaned her head against his shoulder, her voice barely a breath. "Lark it is." The next morning, Xander opened the door to find the land washed clean from a soft rain in the night. The trees shimmered with new leaves and the soil smelled rich beneath his boots. He brought in water, then started a fire for tea. Clara was still in bed, Lark nestled close. She stirred when he came near, her eyes watchful. "You're sure you still want us here?" she asked quietly. He crouched beside her, resting one hand on the cradle he'd finished just the day before. "I want to start something new," he said. "With you." "With her?" She searched his face, then nodded once. Later that week, he took her outside for the first time since the birth. She stood beside him at the edge of the garden, Lark sleeping against her chest in a sling sewn from an old linen sheet. The wind carried the scent of juniper and wet earth. Clara reached out and touched his hand. "I've never had anything steady in my life. Never thought I would. You do now." She didn't speak for a while after that, just looked out at the hills. Then she turned to him and said, "I want to plant roots here. I want to grow with you. If you'll have me." He didn't answer with words. He took her hand and they stood there together, quiet and whole, as the land settled around them like it had been waiting for just this moment. The days warmed slow, the kind of spring that took its time softening the ground and coaxing color from the trees. Clara sat on the porch with Lark in her arms, wrapped snug in a quilt she'd stitched from scraps found in a trunk beneath the bed. The baby's breathing was light against her chest, and each small sound rooted her more firmly to the land beneath her feet. Xander was out by the creek, mending the sluice gate. She could just make out the shape of him through the cottonwoods, shirt sleeves rolled, hat low. He moved with the same quiet focus he always had, like the work centered him. She watched him until the baby stirred, then shifted Lark's weight and began humming under her breath a tune she hadn't thought of in years. When Xander returned, he carried a bundle of willow switches and a small handful of smooth, river-polished stones. He held them out without a word. "For the cradle," he said after a moment. Figured the sound might help her sleep once she's old enough to hear it. Clara reached for one of the stones, turning it over in her hand. "You ever think you'd be the kind of man who made toys?" "I didn't think I'd be the kind of man anyone stayed for." She looked up, holding his gaze. "Well, you are." He sat beside her on the porch step, the wood warm beneath them. Lark shifted in her sleep, her cheek against Clara's collarbone. "You ever thought about marrying again?" she asked. "I never thought I'd get the chance to." Clara glanced down at the baby, then back at him. "I wouldn't ask unless I meant it, but I've been thinking. This isn't just your home anymore, it's ours. Feels like we ought to name it together." He rubbed the back of his neck the way he did when weighing something. "There's an aspen grove up behind the North Ridge," he said. "I used to go there when things felt too loud, even though there was never anyone here to make noise. I'd sit under those trees and try to remember what it felt like to belong somewhere. Maybe we call it Aspen Hollow." Clara smiled, slow and quiet. "Aspen Hollow. Sounds like a place a child could grow strong." That evening they walked the ridge together. Xander carried Lark in a sling he'd fashioned from Clara's old shawl, and Clara kept one hand at his back, steadying him more than herself. The trees whispered above them, leaves just beginning to unfurl. When they reached the grove, she stopped and looked around at the pale trunks rising like quiet sentinels. "How long has it been since you brought anyone here?" she asked. "You're the first." She stepped close, her hand finding his. "Then let's build something here. Not just a life, but a place to mark it. A marker for the day we chose it together." He caught her meaning and his eyes softened. "You want to marry me out here?" "I do." The next morning they stood beneath the aspens, just the three of them. Clara wore a dress she'd patched by hand, and Xander had trimmed his beard for the first time since before winter. They said no vows, just looked at each other, and then down at the child in his arms. He pressed his forehead to hers. "You're not just the only thing missing from my home, Clara. You are my home." She touched his cheek, voice low. "Then let's never leave it." And they didn't. Each day after was quieter than the last, but not empty. Never again empty. Because what they built in the hollow wasn't just a place to live. It was a place to grow, to heal, to hold each other when the wind howled and the nights stretched long. And as Lark grew, she learned to walk barefoot through the aspen leaves, her laughter carrying through the hollow like a promise kept. Summer settled into the valley with the patience of something earned. The days grew long and golden, and the small garden behind the house yielded its first beans and turnips. Clara spent mornings with her sleeves rolled and Lark bundled close against her, pulling weeds with one hand while humming tunes that seemed to keep the baby from fussing. The porch had taken on the scent of lavender from the bundle tied to the post, drying in the sun. Xander came in from the woods one afternoon carrying a brace of grouse and a quiet expression she hadn't seen before. He set the birds on the table, wiped his hands on the cloth by the basin, and stood there a moment, looking at her as if weighing something that had been on his mind a while. "I've got land north of the creek," he said. "About 5 acres past the last cottonwood, soil's darker there, good for corn." She paused in wrapping Lark into her sling. "You thinking of planting more, thinking of building something?" Clara tilted her head. "What kind of something? A second house, smaller, for the future?" The idea turned in her chest slowly like a key in a lock. "You expecting company?" "No," he said, stepping closer. "I'm thinking of your mother." She looked up, startled. "You said she's in Ohio. And you haven't seen her since you left for Missouri." Clara leaned against the edge of the table, her hand resting gently on Lark's back. "I don't know if she's still in the same county, and it's been years." "I wrote to a man I knew in Cincinnati," Xander said. "He used to run a feed store near the train depot. Asked if he could make some inquiries. Got a letter back this week. Said there's a widow named Whitlow living just west of Chillicothe. She's working at a church kitchen." Clara's breath caught. "I thought maybe," he said, "if you wanted to write to her, I'd send the letter with next month's post. If she's willing, we could send for her before first frost." Clara sat down without meaning to. Lark stirred and she adjusted the sling gently. "I haven't thought about her in so long. She wasn't easy, but she loved me the best she knew how." "You don't need to decide anything now," he said. "Only if it feels right." She looked at him for a long time, the way the light through the shutters traced his shoulders, the calluses on his fingers where he'd held an axe since spring thaw. "You remember more of what I say than I do." "I remember everything you say." They didn't speak about it again for 3 days. When she handed him the letter, it was folded twice and tied with a red thread. He didn't open it, just tucked it into the ledger where he kept the accounts and said he'd ride to town on Saturday. That same night, after supper, she brought out a tin box from the cupboard. It held nothing of value: a thimble, a dried sprig of rosemary, a locket with no picture, but she set it on the table like it meant something. "I used to think I didn't want to remember," she said. "But I think what I really wanted was to start again, not erase anything. Just grow past it." Xander didn't answer. He only reached across the table and laid his hand over hers. By late August, Lark was sitting up on her own, reaching for the blue sky with both hands. Clara took to setting her in a basket lined with wool when she worked outside, and the child would babble to the hens as if they were kin. Xander had fashioned a wooden rattle from a broken fence post, and Clara tied a strip of ribbon to it so it wouldn't roll far. One morning, a wagon pulled up just past the gate. It was driven by a man Xander knew from town, and beside him sat a woman in a green shawl, her hair streaked with silver, her mouth tight with nerves. Clara stood on the porch, Lark on her hip. The woman didn't speak right away. She climbed down slow, eyes fastened to the child. "I'd heard you were gone," she said finally. "Didn't expect to hear from you again." Clara didn't answer at first. Then, quietly, "I didn't know if I could forgive, but I kept thinking about the way you used to hum when you needed bread. How you never let me go to sleep without a quilt, even when we were fighting." The woman's eyes filled. "You're the only thing I ever did right." Lark reached out then, small fingers grasping toward the stranger's hand. "Her name's Lark," Clara said. "She likes the sound of running water and hates being out of sight." The older woman smiled through her tears. "She's got your chin." Xander watched from the garden, letting them have the space. Later, when Clara stepped down from the porch and took her mother's hand, he knew the old wounds weren't gone, but they were no longer growing. That winter, they finished the second house. It stood just beyond the garden with a low roof and 2 windows that faced the morning sun. The days shrank, but the fire in their hearth burned steady. Clara made cider from the apples Xander had grafted the year before, and they hung pine boughs over the door when the first snow fell. On the night of the solstice, they sat by the fire after Lark had fallen asleep, her breath soft beneath the wool blanket. "I used to think happiness was a thing that happened to other people," Clara said. Xander traced a line along her wrist with his thumb. "I used to think it wasn't real at all." She turned her hand and laced her fingers through his. "But it is," he nodded, brushing her knuckles with his lips. "It is." And it lasted. Through the seasons that followed, they grew a life from the ground up, built of small things and quiet days. Lark took her first steps beneath the aspens. Clara taught her to read by the fire, and Xander carved her a flute she never quite learned to play. The second house became a place for stories and stitched linens, where Clara's mother baked bread with the same hum that once filled Clara's childhood. Years passed, slow and kind, and in all that time nothing was ever left unsaid, because what they had was built from truth and care and the quiet promise that no one would ever be alone again. They were home, together, always.